You'd think after the fifth stint in rehab, my parents would have drawn the line. But nope. My older brother Mike went back in last year, and they paid every penny of it, again. We're not talking about pocket change here. These rehab programs cost tens of thousands of dollars, the kind with private rooms, horse therapy, and meditation sessions overlooking scenic mountaintops. Meanwhile, when I asked them for help with just one mortgage payment, I got the whole "you're an adult, figure it out" speech. The irony? I've never asked them for a dime before. Not once in my 33 years of life. It stung. No, scratch that, it knocked the wind out of me. My husband, Eric, and I were dealing with a perfect storm of unexpected bills, a leaky roof that turned into a full-blown water damage crisis, a surprise tax bill, and, to top it off, a sudden illness that landed our daughter, Ellie, in the hospital for 2 weeks. We drained our emergency fund, maxed out one credit card, and were trying to juggle the rest. All I needed was help to cover one mortgage payment so we wouldn't fall behind. It wasn't even a gift. I told them we'd pay them back within 2 months. But instead of help, I got a lecture. "You should have planned better," my mom said, her voice heavy with disappointment. My dad chimed in with, "We've worked hard for our money. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. This, from the same people who've sold stocks to cover Mike's latest, fresh start, more times than I can count. And the kicker? They didn't even sound conflicted about it. I don't resent Mike. At least, that's what I keep telling myself. But it's hard not to, just a little. Growing up, he was always the golden child. He got into trouble constantly, but my parents treated him like he was made of glass. Got caught stealing beer from a gas station? Boys will be boys. Failed a semester of college? He's finding himself. Meanwhile, I was the one who followed the rules, kept my grades up, and never asked for anything. And what did that get me? A pat on the back and the unspoken expectation that I'd keep holding it all together. But this wasn't about Mike, not really. This was about the fact that when I finally needed support just once, it was like I didn't even register as someone who might need help. I was the strong one, the dependable one. And, apparently, that meant I wasn't worth their time or money. That night, after their refusal, I sat at the kitchen table with Eric, staring at the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller by the day. "I don't get it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How can they do this for Mike over and over but act like I'm being unreasonable?" Eric reached across the table and took my hand. "Because they know you'll figure it out," he said simply. "You always do. And maybe they don't realize how much that hurts." I didn't respond. What could I say? He was right. I would figure it out. I always did. But for the first time, I wondered if being the strong one was just another way of being invisible. The next day, I did what I always do. I buckled down and started problem solving. I called the mortgage company to see if we could negotiate a temporary deferment. I sold a few pieces of furniture on Craigslist. Eric picked up some extra hours at work, even though it meant missing dinner with Ellie most nights. It was exhausting, but we managed to scrape together enough to cover the payment. Crisis averted for now. But the hurt lingered. Every time I saw my parents, it was like there was a wall between us. I couldn't bring myself to pretend everything was fine, but I also didn't want to start a fight. So I kept my distance. At family dinners, I'd sit quietly while my mom gushed about how well Mike was doing in his sober living house, or how proud she was of his progress. Progress they'd paid for, of course. One night, after another one of these dinners, I texted Mike. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, but I needed to get it out. "Do you realize how much they do for you?" I typed, then deleted. Too aggressive. "Do you ever feel guilty about how much they help you?" Delete. Finally, I settled on, "Do you think it's fair how Mom and Dad treat us?" His response came almost immediately. "You know they're always going to help me. That's just how it is. That's just how it is." The words echoed in my head for days. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the imbalance, just stated it like a fact of life. And maybe it was. But for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could keep living with it. Mike has always been the golden child, and it's been that way for as long as I can remember. It wasn't that he was some prodigy or particularly charming. He just had this uncanny ability to mess up spectacularly and still land on his feet. Thanks to my parents, of course. Growing up, he seemed to skate through life without consequences. Got a speeding ticket? Dad paid it before Mike even knew how much it cost. Flunked a semester of college because he spent too much time partying? They covered the tuition for him to retake every single class. Meanwhile, I, the so-called good kid, couldn't even get them to co-sign my student loans when I got into college. Straight as no detentions and a full ride scholarship. That was my ticket out of high school and into a good university. I worked part-time jobs to cover living expenses, and while it wasn't easy, I prided myself on my independence. My parents always seemed impressed but distant, like my success was expected and therefore not worth celebrating. Mike, on the other hand, was a constant source of chaos. And somehow, chaos always demanded their attention. The disparity between us wasn't just about money. It was in everything. When Mike would blow curfews or get caught sneaking out, my parents would bend over backwards to understand his needs. My curfews? Strictly enforced. If I ever made a mistake, even something small like forgetting to do a chore, it was a lecture about responsibility. But with Mike, it was like they thought their love could fix him, so they never stopped pouring it into him. It's not that I'm jealous of the love they gave him. I'm not. At least, I don't think I am. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice how one-sided it felt. While I was learning to be self-sufficient, Mike was learning that mom and dad would always catch him when he fell. And he fell a lot. I remember one night during my senior year of high school. It was 2 a.m. when the phone rang. Mike had been arrested for possession, his second offense, and my parents were scrambling to bail him out. My mom was crying, my dad was muttering about lawyers, and there I was, standing in the kitchen, invisible. I asked if they needed help, but they just waved me off. Go back to bed, honey. We'll handle this, my mom said through her tears. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering, what would happen if I ever messed up that badly? Would they drop everything to help me? Would they even pick up the phone? Part of me wanted to test it, just to see. But I didn't. I couldn't. That wasn't who I was. The thing is, Mike's problems didn't just affect him. They affected all of us. Every time he hit a new low, it became the family's crisis. The late-night calls were just the tip of the iceberg. There were interventions that turned into shouting matches, holidays ruined by his emergencies, and a never-ending cycle of hope and disappointment. Every time he went to rehab, we all convinced ourselves that this would be the time it worked. And every time he relapsed, it felt like a slap in the face. But the worst part was the lies. Oh, the lies. Mike had a way of twisting the truth to suit his needs, and my parents fell for it every time. He'd say he was clean when he wasn't, or that he was job hunting when he was really sitting at home playing video games. Once, he even convinced them to give him $5,000 for a business venture. It wasn't until months later that we found out he'd spent it on drugs and a new gaming console. My dad was furious, but my mom just sighed and said, he's struggling. He needs our support. And so, the cycle continued. No matter how many times he burned them, they always came back for more. I stopped trying to intervene after a while. What was the point? They couldn't see the forest for the trees, and Mike was more than happy to take advantage of their blind spots. What really stung was how they justified it. Anytime I tried to bring up the double standard, they'd brush it off. Mike needs us more, they'd say. You're so strong and independent. We don't worry about you like we do him. As if my strength was a reason to ignore me. As if being dependable made me less deserving of their help. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need them the way Mike did. But deep down, I think I always knew that wasn't true. Everyone needs support sometimes, even the strong ones. I just never thought I'd have to fight so hard for it. When I finally asked for help with the mortgage, it wasn't just about the money, it was about proving to myself that they cared as much about me as they did about Mike. Their response didn't just sting. It broke something inside me. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. Looking back, I think that was the moment I realized how much I'd been carrying all these years. Not just the financial burdens or the emotional weight of always being the strong one, but the silent resentment of being second place in my own family. It was a lifetime of Mike, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I could carry it anymore. When I called my mom about the mortgage, I had to psych myself up for it. Asking for help didn't come naturally to me, not after a lifetime of being the strong one. But after everything Eric and I had been through recently, I didn't see another option. Our daughter Ellie's sudden hospital stay had wiped out our savings in one fell swoop. Between the medical bills, the roof repairs, and unexpected costs piling up, we were drowning. We just needed help covering one mortgage payment to keep our heads above water. The phone call started out normal enough. I caught her up on Ellie's recovery, which, to her credit, she seemed genuinely happy to hear about. But as soon as I shifted the conversation to our financial situation, her tone changed. I wouldn't be asking if it weren't serious, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We just need help with one payment, $1, $200, and we'll pay you back in 2 months. Tops. There was a long pause. For a second, I thought the call had dropped. Then she said it. Honey, you're smart. You'll figure it out. At first, I wasn't even sure I'd heard her right. Mom, I'm not asking for a handout. I'm just asking for a little support. This is the first time I've ever come to you for help. Her laugh was light, almost dismissive. Of course, dear. But you know your father, and I can't just hand out money every time someone's in a tough spot. Every time, I almost dropped the phone. I couldn't help myself. This is the first time I've asked for anything, Mom. Ever. You've spent tens of thousands on Mike's rehab, his debts, his... Don't do that, she interrupted, her voice sharp. Mike's situation is different. He needed us, and I don't. I said before I could stop myself. I wasn't prepared for how much her words would hurt. You're not in trouble, though, she said, like it was obvious. You've always been the strong one, the responsible one. You'll find a way to make it work. There it was. The unspoken rule of our family, laid out as plain as day. Mike needed their help because he was a mess, and I didn't because I wasn't. Never mind that we were one missed payment away from losing the home we'd worked so hard for. Never mind that I was barely keeping it together. Are you and Dad having money troubles? I asked, grasping at straws. It was the only explanation I could think of for why they'd refused to help. She laughed again, this time like I'd suggested something ridiculous. No, dear, we're fine. We just have to be careful, you know? Retirement isn't cheap. I wanted to scream. Instead, I thanked her for her time and hung up before I said something I'd regret. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head, each word like a fresh wound. When Eric came home from work, he found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills I'd been avoiding all day. How'd it go? He asked gently, already knowing the answer from the look on my face. She said no, I said, my voice flat. She said I'll figure it out because I'm smart. Eric sat down across from me and took my hand. I'm sorry, he said softly. He didn't try to sugarcoat it or offer empty platitudes, and for that, I was grateful. We'll figure it out, I said, though the words felt hollow. We will, he said firmly. And somehow, I believed him. That night, after Ellie went to bed, we sat down and came up with a plan. Eric picked up extra shifts at work, and I started selling anything we didn't absolutely need. Old furniture, clothes, even a couple of pieces of jewelry I'd been holding onto since college. It wasn't enough to solve all our problems, but it was enough to buy us some time. Still, I couldn't shake the hurt. Every time I saw my parents, it was like there was a wall between us. I couldn't bring myself to pretend everything was fine, but I also didn't want to start a fight. So I kept my distance. At family dinners, I stayed quiet while my mom went on about how proud she was of Mike for staying sober, or how well he was doing in his new job. Both things they'd paid for, of course. The worst part was, they didn't even seem to notice the change in me. Or if they did, they didn't care enough to ask about it. One night, after another painful family dinner, I texted Mike. I wasn't sure why, but I needed to get it off my chest. Do you ever feel guilty about how much Mom and Dad do for you? I wrote. His response came almost immediately. No. Why would I? I stared at the screen, dumbfounded. Because they've spent thousands bailing you out, and they won't even help me with one mortgage payment, I typed, my hands shaking. He replied with a shrug emoji. An emoji. Then, they've always taken care of me. That's just how it is. That's just how it is. The words felt like a slap in the face. It was like he didn't even care how unfair it was. Or worse, he knew and didn't care. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, but instead, I just sat there, staring at his message until the screen went dark. For the first time, I wondered if this wasn't just about money. Maybe it never had been. Maybe this was about the simple fact that in our family, Mike would always come first, and I would always come second. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I could live with that anymore. After that call with my mom, I sat on my couch staring at the empty space in front of me. The bills were still stacked on the coffee table, an unavoidable reminder of how close we were to losing the house. But in that moment, it wasn't just the financial stress weighing on me, it was the ache of feeling like a stranger to my own family. I couldn't stop thinking about how different things would have been if I were Mike. If it had been him in my position, they wouldn't have hesitated. They would have rushed over with a blank check and assurances that everything would be okay. But for me, I got figured out. It wasn't just the refusal that stung, it was the lack of empathy. My mom hadn't even sounded concerned, let alone supportive. No, how can we help in other ways? Or, is there anything we can do? Just a cold, matter-of-fact dismissal that made me feel invisible. Like my struggles didn't matter. Or worse, like they were an inconvenience. Later that night, when Eric got home, I finally let it all out. He found me in the kitchen, pretending to clean, but I was really just moving dishes around aimlessly. They said no. I blurted out as soon as he walked in, my voice trembling. They don't think I need their help because I'm strong. Eric set down his bag and came over, wrapping me in a hug. I'm sorry, he said softly. You didn't deserve that. We stood there in silence for a while before he pulled back and looked me in the eye. You know what I think, he said, his tone gentle but firm. I think they've gotten so used to you being strong that they've forgotten you're human too. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd always prided myself on being the dependable one, the one who could handle anything. But now, for the first time, I wondered if that had been a mistake. Had I been so good at managing my own life that my parents stopped seeing me as someone who might need help? Had my independence turned me into a background character in my own family? The thought made me feel sick. I didn't want to be bitter, but I couldn't ignore the resentment bubbling up inside me. For years, I'd been the one keeping everything together, keeping myself together, while Mike burned through their time, money, and patience. And what had it gotten me? A pat on the back and a "you'll figure it out." Later that night, as Eric and I sat in bed scrolling through our phones, I made a decision. I pulled up Mike's number and typed out a message before I could overthink it. Do you ever feel guilty about how much mom and dad do for you? I wrote. I hesitated for a moment, then hit send. I didn't even know what I was hoping for, an apology? An acknowledgement that he understood how unfair it was? Maybe just some small sign that I wasn't crazy for feeling this way. His reply came almost instantly. No. Why would I? I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. I don't know why I was surprised. This was Mike after all, but something about his casual indifference made my blood boil. Because they've spent tens of thousands on you, and they won't even help me with one mortgage payment, I typed back, my hands shaking. His response was so fast it was almost insulting. They've always helped me. That's just how it is. That's just how it is. The words felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the lack of remorse. It was the complete lack of awareness. Mike didn't even care how much they'd sacrificed for him, or how little they'd done for me. To him, it was all perfectly normal. Expected. I didn't reply. What was the point? Instead, I tossed my phone onto the nightstand and buried my face in my hands. Eric rubbed my back, but I could tell he didn't know what to say. What could he say? My family dynamics were so deeply entrenched that even I didn't know how to unravel them. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. As I went through my usual routine, packing Ellie's lunch, tidying up the house, checking my emails, I couldn't shake the heaviness. The idea that this wasn't just about money, but something much deeper. Something broken. For years, I'd told myself that being the strong one was a badge of honor. That my parents' trust in my ability to handle life on my own was a compliment, not a dismissal. But now, I wasn't so sure. Was it really a compliment if it meant being overlooked? If it meant being left to fend for myself, while Mike was showered with support, no matter how much he squandered it? I thought back to all the times I'd stepped up when Mike failed. The time he borrowed my car and crashed it, and I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want them to stress. The time I covered for him, when he skipped out on a family event to go party. The countless times I bit my tongue when he lied to their faces about being sober, because I didn't want to be the one to shatter their illusions. Had my loyalty and independence been used against me all this time? Had I trained my parents to see me as someone who didn't need them, even when I did? By the end of the day, I was emotionally drained. I called my best friend, Sarah, who'd been my sounding board for years. Do you think I'm overreacting? I asked after recounting the whole saga. Not at all, she said without hesitation. Honestly, it sounds like your parents have been so focused on saving Mike that they've forgotten you're a person with needs too. That's not fair to you. Her words echoed Eric's from the night before, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of validation. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe I did deserve better. That night, as I sat down to pay what bills I could with the money we'd scraped together, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let this slide. I didn't know how or when, but I was going to make them see me, not just as the strong one, but as someone who deserved their love and support too. And if they couldn't, well, maybe it was time to stop carrying the weight of this family all by myself. I couldn't let it go. No matter how much I tried to push it to the back of my mind, the mortgage fiasco kept gnawing at me. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the principle, the blatant favoritism, and the way my parents had shrugged off my struggles like they were nothing. I needed them to understand how much their dismissal had hurt me, and if they didn't understand, then at least I could say I tried. So, I called my mom and asked if we could have a family meeting. She sounded hesitant at first, probably sensing the tension in my voice, but she eventually agreed. I told her I wanted Dad and Mike to be there too, which seemed to catch her off guard. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone cautious. "We'll talk about it at the meeting," I said. I didn't trust myself to get into it over the phone without losing my temper. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday afternoon at my parent house. Eric stayed home with Ellie. I didn't want her to overhear what I knew was going to be a messy conversation. I showed up a few minutes early, hoping to steel myself with a cup of coffee before diving in, but my mom greeted me at the door with a worried look. "What's this all about?" she asked, wringing her hands. "You'll see," I said, forcing a smile. Inside, my stomach was doing somersaults. Mike arrived next, looking as casual as ever in ripped jeans and a hoodie. He barely acknowledged me as he walked past, his phone already glued to his hand. Dad followed shortly after, and once we were all seated in the living room, I took a deep breath and began. "I want to talk about something that's been bothering me for a while," I started, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "It's about how our family handles support, financial and otherwise." My dad raised an eyebrow, and my mom shifted uncomfortably on the couch. Mike didn't even look up from his phone. I launched into the mortgage story, recounting every detail of my conversation with Mom and the financial struggles that had led me to ask for help in the first place. I kept my tone measured, but I didn't sugarcoat anything. "It wasn't just about the money," I said. "It was about feeling like, for once, I could count on you the way Mike always has." At the mention of Mike's name, my dad's expression hardened. "This isn't about your brother," he said, crossing his arms. "We help where it's needed. And you didn't think I needed help this time? Just once." I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Do you know how humiliating it was to ask in the first place? And then to be told to figure it out like my struggles don't matter?" My mom started crying then, her go-to-defense mechanism whenever she didn't want to answer a hard question. "We've always tried to do what's best for both of you," she said through tears. "It's not easy making these decisions." I wanted to feel sympathy for her, but I couldn't. Not this time. "It's not a decision when you don't even consider me," I said. "Mike screws up, and you're there for him in a heartbeat. But when I come to you with one thing, you act like I'm asking for the world." Mike finally looked up from his phone, but only to roll his eyes. "Oh, here we go," he muttered. I turned to him, my anger boiling over. "Do you think this is fair, Mike? That they've spent thousands on you, rehab, legal fees, whatever, but they couldn't even help me with one mortgage payment?" He shrugged, his face a mask of indifference. "Life's not fair," he said, his voice dripping with apathy. "You're doing fine." "Am I?" I snapped. "Do you even know what I've been dealing with? Or do you just assume everything's fine because I'm not making it everyone else's problem like you do?" "Enough," my dad barked, his tone sharp. "This isn't productive." "Productive?" I repeated, incredulous. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the double standards in this family, and you're acting like I'm the problem." "This isn't about double standards," he said, his voice firm. "It's about priorities. Mike's had challenges that you haven't. And what about my challenges?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Do they not count because I've handled them on my own? Do I have to fall apart like Mike to get your attention?" The room fell silent after that, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. My mom sniffled and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My dad looked down at his hands, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something like regret flicker across his face. Mike, predictably, went back to scrolling on his phone. "I don't want your money," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I wanted to feel like I mattered, like I could count on you. But instead, I feel like I've spent my whole life being punished for being the strong one." Nobody responded. The silence was deafening. After a few minutes, I stood up. "Thanks for listening," I said, even though I wasn't sure they had. Then I grabbed my bag and walked out the door. The car ride home was a blur. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the anger had given way to exhaustion. Eric was waiting for me in the kitchen, a concerned look on his face. "How'd it go?" he asked. "As expected," I said with a bitter laugh. "They don't get it. And I don't think they ever will." He pulled me into a hug, and for the first time all day, I felt a sense of relief. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to keep pouring myself into a family that couldn't, or wouldn't, pour anything back. The family meeting had been a disaster. I'd gone in hoping for some semblance of understanding, maybe even an apology, but I left with nothing but anger and a deeper sense of alienation. My parents had refused to acknowledge the blatant double standard, brushing off my concerns with the same dismissive tone they'd used my whole life. Mike, true to form, walked out halfway through. No apology, no defense, just a shrug and a muttered whatever as he disappeared out the front door. I sat in my car after the meeting, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding, not just from the anger, but from the overwhelming realization that nothing was going to change. They didn't see the problem, and worse, they didn't seem to care enough to try. I had spent years bending over backward to be the perfect daughter, the dependable one, the fixer. But what had that ever gotten me? Certainly not the love and support I'd been craving. By the time I got home, my anger had turned into something colder, more resolute. If they wouldn't see the problem, maybe I needed to make them see it. And if they still didn't? Well, then maybe it was time to stop trying altogether. The decision to take a step back wasn't an easy one, but it felt necessary. It wasn't about punishing them or being petty, it was about self-preservation. I couldn't keep playing the role of the strong one when it was so clearly a one-way street. If my parents were going to prioritize Mike, no matter what, then I needed to prioritize myself. So I called my mom and told her I needed space. I'm not cutting you off, I clarified, but I won't be coming to family dinners or events for a while. I need some time to think. She sounded hurt, which I expected, but she didn't argue. Well, if that's what you need, she said quietly, her voice tinged with guilt. I thought maybe, just maybe, this might be the wake-up call they needed. It wasn't. At first, they seemed to think I was bluffing. My mom would call with updates about Mike, as if nothing had changed, and my dad would text me reminders about upcoming family get-togethers. Sunday dinner at 6, one text read, like I hadn't just told them I wasn't coming anymore. When I didn't show up, they acted surprised, even indignant. You could have at least told us, my dad said when he called afterward. I did tell you, I replied, my patience already worn thin. But the real test came with Thanksgiving. It was the first major holiday since I decided to step back, and I knew skipping it would send a clear message. Part of me dreaded the fallout, but another part of me, the part that was still simmering with resentment, felt a grim satisfaction. I was tired of being the one who always showed up, no matter how invisible I felt when I did. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up to a flurry of messages from my mom. Happy Thanksgiving, one read, complete with a turkey emoji. Can't wait to see you later, read another. I ignored them. As the day went on, the messages became more frantic. Are you coming? Everyone's asking about you. And then, finally, why are you doing this to us? I didn't respond. Instead, I spent the day with Eric and Ellie, making a small, quiet dinner at home. It wasn't the big, boisterous holiday I was used to, but for the first time in years, I felt at peace. There was no tension, no pretending, no walking on eggshells around Mike. Just my little family, safe and happy, in our own bubble. The fallout came the next day. My phone was flooded with missed calls and voicemails from both my parents. My moms were tearful and pleading, please call me back. We need to talk. My dads were angrier. This isn't how families act, you know. We've always been there for you. I ignored most of them, but when my dad texted, we miss you, I finally replied, I miss being treated like I matter. His response came hours later, a simple, I'm sorry if you feel that way. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just another dismissal wrapped in a thin veneer of regret. It was like he couldn't even fathom the idea that he might have done something wrong. Over the next few weeks, the calls and texts continued, alternating between guilt trips and attempts at reconciliation. My mom would send messages like, your father, and I just want what's best for you, while my dad would drop passive-aggressive gems like, families don't give up on each other. Even Mike chimed in at one point, texting, are you really going to make a big deal out of this? As if my feelings were just an inconvenience to him. I didn't budge. Every time I felt myself wavering, I thought back to that family meeting, to the way they had dismissed my pain and prioritized Mike yet again. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn their approval, and how little it had ever gotten me. And I thought about Ellie, who was still too young to understand any of this, but who deserved a mom who didn't let herself be treated like an afterthought. Eventually, the calls and messages slowed down. I think they realized I wasn't coming back, not until something changed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control over my own life. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't what I wanted, but it was what I needed. Because at the end of the day, I deserved more than to be the strong one. I deserved to be seen, to be supported, to be loved. And if my family couldn't give me that, then I'd find it elsewhere. The guilt trips started almost immediately, as if they'd been lying in wait for the perfect moment to pounce. Barely a day had passed since I skipped Thanksgiving when my mom called, her voice already thick with tears. "Why are you doing this to us?" she asked, her words trembling with a mix of sadness and accusation. "Do you know how hard it was to sit at that table and explain to everyone why you weren't there? You're tearing the family apart." Her words stung, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. "I'm not tearing the family apart, Mom," I said firmly. "I'm just taking a step back to protect myself. I've explained this already, but we're family," she said, her voice breaking. "We're supposed to stick together, no matter what." It took everything in me not to snap back. Family was their favorite weapon, the trump card they played whenever they wanted to dismiss my feelings. "I need you to understand that this isn't about abandoning the family," I said as calmly as I could. "It's about setting boundaries so I don't keep getting hurt." But she wasn't ready to hear it. "Boundaries?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Since when do you need boundaries from your own parents?" I didn't answer. I just told her I needed to go and hung up before the conversation spiraled any further. The next few days were more of the same. My dad left me a voicemail that started off calm and reasonable, but quickly turned into a lecture. "You know, families are supposed to have loyalty," he said. "We've always been there for you, and now you're acting like we're the bad guys. This isn't how families work." It wasn't just my parents, either. Mike, ever the picture of emotional depth, sent me a single text. "Are you really going to make a big deal out of this?" A big deal? I stared at his message, my blood boiling. This wasn't about some petty argument or misunderstanding. This was about years of being overlooked, dismissed, and taken for granted. But of course, Mike wouldn't see it that way. Why would he? He'd been the beneficiary of their unwavering support for his entire life. To him, my feelings were probably nothing more than an inconvenient speed bump in his otherwise cushy existence. I debated responding, but decided against it. Arguing with Mike was like yelling into a void. It would only leave me exhausted and unheard. Instead, I focused on holding my ground with my parents, which was harder than I thought it would be. Every time I ignored a call or a message, I felt a pang of guilt. But I reminded myself that I wasn't cutting them off. I was just giving myself the space I needed to heal. Of course, they twisted that into me being ungrateful and dramatic. My mom sent me a long, emotional email about everything they'd done for me over the years, helping with my wedding, babysitting Ellie, hosting family holidays. She listed every perceived favor as if I owed them eternal, unquestioning loyalty in return. "I'm not saying we're perfect," she wrote, "but we've always tried our best. I just don't understand why you're punishing us like this." Punishing them. That word stuck with me. It was so far from what I was trying to do, but it was clear they saw my boundaries as an attack, not an act of self-preservation. For the first time, I started to wonder if they were even capable of seeing things from my perspective. But as frustrating as their guilt trips were, something unexpected started to happen. For once in my life, I wasn't pouring all my energy into fixing things with my parents. I wasn't bending over backward to keep the peace or letting their needs and expectations take priority over my own. And you know what? It felt good. Freeing, even. What surprised me most, though, was how much support I got from Eric's side of the family. They'd always been warm and welcoming, but I'd never leaned on them the way I was now. When Eric told his mom about everything that had been going on, she didn't hesitate to step in. "Your family," she said simply. "And families help each other." They didn't just offer kind words, either. When Eric's parents heard about our financial struggles, they insisted on helping us cover a couple of bills, no strings attached. His sister came over to babysit Ellie so Eric and I could have a much-needed night to ourselves. And when I broke down crying one night, overwhelmed by the combination of guilt, anger, and relief, it was Eric's mom who sat with me, holding my hand and telling me it was okay to put myself first for once. Their kindness was a revelation. I'd spent so many years prioritizing my parents' approval, bending over backward to be the perfect daughter, that I'd never stopped to consider what I was missing. Being around Eric's family made me realize how love and support were supposed to feel, unconditional, freely given, and without the expectation of something in return. Over the weeks that followed, the contrast between my two families became painfully clear. My parents kept calling, texting and emailing, their messages swinging wildly between guilt and anger. "You're being selfish," one text from my dad read. "Think about how this is affecting your mother." Meanwhile, Eric's family kept showing up in quiet, meaningful ways, sending meals when they knew we were busy, inviting us over for casual dinners, offering to take Ellie for the weekend so we could have some time to recharge. They didn't make me feel like a burden or accuse me of tearing the family apart. They just cared. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't have to prove my worth to be loved. I didn't have to carry the weight of everyone else's expectations or put my own needs last. It was a strange feeling, but a good one. And it made me realize just how much I'd been settling for in my relationship with my parents. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel more confident in my decision to set boundaries. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when the guilt crept in, and I'd wonder if I was being too harsh. But then I'd remind myself of all the times I'd put their needs above my own, and how little they'd done to reciprocate. I wasn't tearing the family apart. I was finally putting myself back together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was worth the effort. Months passed. Months of silence, passive-aggressive texts, and the occasional guilt-laden voicemail from my mom. By this point, I had almost resigned myself to the idea that my parents might never truly understand how much they'd hurt me. The distance I'd created felt like both a relief and a wound, a necessary step toward healing, but one that came at the cost of the closeness I'd always wanted from my family. Still, I stayed firm in my boundaries. I wasn't ready to reach out, and I wasn't going to rush things just to make them more comfortable. Then one day, completely out of the blue, my dad showed up at my house. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen prepping dinner while Eric and Ellie played in the backyard. The knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there he was, standing on the porch with a pie in his hands. He looked older, more tired than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders were slumped, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the pie untouched between us. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the stack of Ellie's toys in the corner, the framed photos on the wall, the half-finished puzzle on the counter. It was as if he was seeing my life for the first time, really seeing it. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, breaking the silence. I blinked, caught off guard. My dad wasn't exactly known for his emotional openness. "Okay," I said cautiously. "I'm listening." He took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting on the table.
"We've been wrong," he said.
"About a lot of things. About how we've treated you, how we've handled everything." He looked up at me, his expression earnest, but tinged with regret. "We didn't realize how much we were leaning on you to be the stable one. And how unfair that was." My throat tightened, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "It's not an excuse," he went on, "but I think your mom and I got so caught up in trying to save Mike that we didn't stop to think about what it was costing you. We just assumed you were fine, because you always seemed fine. But that doesn't make it right." His words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had been waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, some sign that they understood how lopsided their support had been. And here it was finally after all this time. It wasn't a perfect apology. There was still a lot unsaid, a lot of hurt that couldn't be undone. But it was something. "I don't know if we can fix everything," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I want to try. I don't want to lose you." I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I swallowed hard to keep my emotions in check. "It's not about fixing everything," I said quietly. "It's about feeling like I matter. Like I'm not just an afterthought because I'm the one who doesn't cause problems." "You do matter," he said quickly, almost desperately. "I know we haven't shown it the way we should, but you do. And I'm sorry for making you feel otherwise." We talked for a while after that, more honestly than we ever had before. He didn't have all the answers, and I didn't expect him to. But for the first time, I felt like he was really listening, really trying to understand where I was coming from. By the time he left, I felt a small but significant shift in the weight I'd been carrying. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter. A few days later, my mom called. Her tone was hesitant, like she wasn't sure how I'd respond. "Your dad said he came to see you," she began. "Yeah," I said simply. There was a pause, and then she added, "I wanted to call sooner, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." I stayed quiet, waiting to see where she was going with this. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she continued. about how we've treated you and Mike. And I think you're right. We've put too much on you because you're so capable and we haven't given you the support you deserve. That was wrong of us. Her words were softer, more tentative than my dad's had been. But they carried the same undercurrent of regret. You know we just want what's best for everyone, she added. We've always wanted that. But I see now that we didn't always go about it the right way. It wasn't the perfect apology I dreamed of. There were still hints of defensiveness, still an undertone of, we meant well. But it was more than I'd expected. And it was a start. I didn't forgive them completely, not yet. There was too much history, too many wounds that still needed time to heal. But for the first time, I felt like they were genuinely trying. And that was more than I'd thought possible just a few months earlier. When I told Eric about the conversations, he smiled and gave my hand a squeeze. Sounds like progress, he said. Yeah, I agreed, though I still felt a flicker of caution. We'll see where it goes. For now, I was content to take things one step at a time. I wasn't ready to throw myself back into the family dynamic I'd worked so hard to step away from, but I was open to the idea of rebuilding, slowly, carefully, on my terms. And, for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was enough. Things didn't magically get better overnight. How could they? Years of ingrained family dynamics don't just disappear with a few heartfelt conversations. But there were changes, small at first, then more noticeable over time. My parents seemed to make a conscious effort to be more balanced in how they treated Mike and me. They didn't swoop in to rescue him at the first sign of trouble, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they seemed to be holding him accountable. Mike, predictably, didn't take it well at first. When my parents told him they wouldn't cover his rent for the sober living house anymore, he called me in a rage. Can you believe this? He fumed. They're just cutting me off like I'm nothing. They're not cutting you off, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They're giving you a chance to figure things out on your own. That's easy for you to say, he snapped. You've never had to deal with what I've been through? I bit back a sharp reply. We'd had this argument before, and it never went anywhere. Instead, I said, you're stronger than you think, Mike. But you have to want to do the work. He hung up on me, but a week later, I heard from my mom that he'd found a part-time job to cover his expenses. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as much as I wanted to feel vindicated, I mostly just felt relief. Maybe, finally, he was ready to take responsibility for his life. Meanwhile, I started being more vocal about my needs and boundaries. It wasn't easy. After years of defaulting to the role of the strong one, it felt almost unnatural to say, I need help with this, or I can't handle that right now. But every time I did, it got a little easier. And, to my surprise, my parents actually started to listen. One evening, after a particularly rough week at work, my mom called and asked if I'd be coming over for Sunday dinner. Normally, I would have said yes, even if it meant pushing myself past the point of exhaustion. But this time I paused. I'm really tired, Mom, I said. I think I need to stay home and rest. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and I braced myself for the usual guilt trip. But instead, she said, I understand. Take care of yourself, okay? I almost dropped the phone. Thanks, Mom, I said, my voice thick with surprise and gratitude. Moments like that weren't the norm, at least not yet, but they were becoming more frequent. My parents still had their slip-ups, of course. There were times when they reverted to their old habits, treating Mike like a fragile victim and me like the rock they could lean on. But when it happened, I didn't let it slide. I called them out, gently but firmly, and each time, they seemed to take it more seriously. Rebuilding my relationship with Mike was a different kind of challenge. He wasn't used to me setting boundaries, and at first he pushed back hard. You're acting like you're better than me, he said during one particularly heated conversation. I'm not better than you, I replied, trying to stay calm. But I deserve to be treated with the same respect and consideration that you do. And that means I'm not going to let you walk all over me anymore. He didn't respond, but I could see the gears turning in his head. Over time, our conversations became less combative and more honest. He started opening up about his struggles, not in a manipulative, excuse-laden way, but in a way that felt real. He admitted that hitting rock bottom had been a wake-up call, and while he was still figuring things out, he was trying to do better. It wasn't a perfect relationship. How could it be after everything we'd been through? But it was better. And for the first time, I felt like we were meeting each other as equals, not as the golden child and the strong one. For me, the biggest shift was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could handle or how little I asked for. I started believing, really believing, that I deserved support, love, and understanding, just as much as anyone else. It wasn't easy to unlearn years of conditioning, but every small act of self-advocacy felt like a victory. One day, I was talking to Eric about everything that had happened over the past few months, and he said something that stuck with me. "You've spent so much of your life being strong for everyone else," he said. "I'm glad you're finally letting people be strong for you." I smiled, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "It's a work in progress," I admitted.
"That's okay," he said.
"Progress is all that matters." The changes in my family weren't perfect, and I didn't expect them to be. There were still moments of frustration, still times when I felt like I was fighting the same old battles. But there were also moments of hope, moments when I could see real growth, not just in them, but in myself. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just the strong one. I was someone who mattered, someone who deserved support and care, not because of what I could do for others, but simply because I was me. And that, more than anything, felt like a victory worth celebrating. Looking back, it's clear this was never just about the money. The mortgage payment, Mike's endless bailouts, my parents' refusal to help me when I finally asked, it was all a symptom of something much deeper. For years, I had felt like my worth in the family was tied to my independence, while Mike's was tied to his neediness. I was the strong one, the fixer, the dependable daughter who didn't need anything from anyone. And because I didn't ask, they assumed I didn't need. But the truth is, everyone needs support sometimes. Everyone deserves to feel valued, not just for what they can handle or accomplish, but simply for who they are. It took me a long time and a lot of heartache to learn that, and even longer to believe it. When I first started pulling back from my parents, I thought it would feel like a punishment. I thought I'd be consumed by guilt, that I'd feel like I was betraying them somehow. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized something unexpected. The distance didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bending over backward to meet someone else's expectations. I wasn't swallowing my own needs to keep the peace. I was prioritizing myself, and it felt good. Of course, that didn't mean it was easy. There were moments when the guilt crept in, moments when I wondered if I was being too harsh, too dramatic, too selfish. But every time I felt myself wavering, I thought back to the years I had spent quietly enduring the imbalance in our family. All the times I'd let things slide, told myself it didn't matter, or convinced myself that being the strong one was enough. And I reminded myself that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. One of the biggest lessons I learned was that boundaries aren't just about keeping people out, they're about protecting what matters most. For me, that meant protecting my mental health, my sense of self-worth, and my little family with Eric and Ellie. It meant refusing to let anyone, even my parents, take more from me than I was willing to give. In the months since my dad's unexpected visit, things have continued to evolve. My parents still aren't perfect. Old habits die hard, and there are moments when they slip back into their familiar patterns. But they're trying, and that means more to me than I can put into words. Mike, surprisingly, has also made strides. He's been sober for almost a year now, and while our relationship is far from perfect, it's better than it's ever been. We've started having real conversations, ones where we're honest about our feelings and our frustrations. He's even admitted, albeit grudgingly, that he's relied on our parents too much in the past. "I guess I didn't really think about how it affected you," he said during one of our talks. "I'm sorry for that." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was sincere.
And that was enough for me.
The most important change, though, has been in myself. I've stopped trying to be the perfect daughter, the one who never complains, never falters, never needs anything. I've learned to ask for help when I need it, and to accept it without guilt. I've learned to say no, to set limits, to prioritize my own well-being without feeling like I'm letting anyone down. It's a work in progress, of course. There are still days when I catch myself slipping back into old habits, putting others' needs ahead of my own or hesitating to speak up for fear of causing conflict. But those moments are becoming less frequent. And when they do happen, I remind myself of how far I've come. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's that value isn't something you have to earn. It's not about how much you can handle or how little you ask for. It's not about being the strong one or the needy one. It's about recognizing your own worth and refusing to settle for anything less than the respect and care you deserve. For years, I thought my strength was my greatest asset. But now I realize it was also my greatest blind spot. I thought being strong meant never asking for help, never showing vulnerability, never admitting that I couldn't do it all on my own. But true strength isn't about going it alone. It's about knowing when to let others in. My parents are still learning this lesson, and so am I. Our family will never be perfect, but it doesn't have to be. What matters is that we're trying. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm not just the strong one. I'm someone who matters, someone who deserves to be seen, supported, and valued. And that, more than anything, is the lesson I'll carry with me.